He slid my access badge across the table before I'd even sat down. Not an envelope, not a letter. My badge. The one that opened bank portals, insurer dashboards, and rooms executives pretended not to understand. Grant Holloway pushed it with 2 fingers. Casual, like spare change. No HR, no paper trail, just muscle memory arrogance. "Let's keep this efficient," he said, already leaning back. Then he started asking questions that had nothing to do with work. How I was feeling, whether I was sleeping well, if I planned to slow down. His voice carried that polished concern men use when they want credit for empathy without paying for it. Finally, he smiled and delivered the line he'd come to say. "Pregnancy changes priorities. This role doesn't have room for that. I am Lila Hayes, Director of Compliance Strategy. I am the reason our credit lines don't evaporate during reviews and our insurance premiums don't spike after executive mistakes. I don't chase headlines. I prevent disasters. Banks recognize my name. Insurers trust my documentation. Grant knows exactly who I am. He just believes speed beats safeguards. There was no termination letter, no policy citation, no HR script. Just Grant explaining the company needed someone fully committed, repeating it slowly, as if cadence could substitute legality. When I asked what performance issue justified this, he said leadership requires decisiveness. When I asked who approved it, he said leadership did, singular. Grant measures power by how fast he can act. I measure it by what survives scrutiny. He waved away my questions, calling this a clean transition, clean for him, risky for everyone else. I could already see the exposure forming, quiet and undeniable. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I took notes. Silence is a better witness than outrage. Grant stood, signaling the meeting was over, already reaching for his phone like I was a resolved notification. I picked up my badge, felt its familiar weight, then asked one question, steady and professional. Should I notify our insurers myself? Or will legal handle that? Grant laughed, sharp and dismissive. That won't be necessary. He didn't notice my pen stop. He didn't notice how confidence can sound exactly like ignorance, right before it becomes expensive. As the new year begins, I'm curious, what plans are you carrying with you into these first quiet days? And what are you hoping finally falls into place? This time, I truly hope the year ahead meets you with steadier ground and gives back some of what you've been working toward. Where are you listening from right now if this story speaks to you? Stay with me and subscribe, because what happens next is where silence starts turning into consequences. The silence around my desk was louder than any confrontation Grant could have staged. No one looked up as I slid folders into a box. Not even the people who used to ask me to translate legal language into something survivable. Screens glowed, keyboards tapped. Everyone pretended nothing was happening. And that hurt more than the meeting itself. I moved slowly, not because I was weak, but because I was taking inventory. I built the compliance framework that let this company refinance at lower rates when lenders were circling. I wrote the controls that convinced insurers we were disciplined instead of reckless. Last year, when an executive misstep almost triggered a coverage review, I worked through the night to contain it. No headlines, no lawsuits, just quiet damage control that saved millions. Grant appeared in my doorway like a concerned neighbor, hands open, voice low. He asked if I needed boxes, offered to smooth things over with facilities, mentioned how difficult these decisions were for leadership. Then he blamed the board. Pressure from above, he said. Timing issues, market expectations, all the usual phrases executives use when they want absolution without accountability. I listened and realized something cold and unmistakable. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew the law. He knew the exposure. He had simply decided it wouldn't apply to him. That was his real talent, not vision or confidence, but the belief that consequences were for other people. When I walked out, no one followed, not a single goodbye. By the time I reached the parking garage, my jaw ached from holding everything in. I drove home in silence, hands steady, thoughts loud. Anger wanted somewhere to land, but discipline kept it contained. That discipline had kept this company alive more than once. At home, I set the box down and sat at the kitchen table without opening it. Then I called Ethan Cole. I didn't explain the meeting in detail. I didn't complain. I just said I'd been let go and that it was over. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did when something mattered. There was a pause on the line, long enough for my breath to catch. Then he asked one question, calm and precise. Did he put the reason in writing? I swallowed and answered honestly, yes. I slept that night without dreams. Not because I was calm, but because something inside me had gone still. In the morning, Ethan didn't rush to fix anything. He didn't raise his voice or talk about lawsuits or revenge. He listened, then asked me to sit, as if what mattered now was precision, not emotion. He spoke plainly. Being fired for pregnancy wasn't just wrong, he said. It was a governance trigger. Companies insured their leaders against mistakes, not against deliberate violations of protected rights. Pregnancy discrimination sat high on every insurer's list, especially under directors' and officers' coverage. When that line was crossed, protection didn't weaken, it disappeared. I followed every word. This wasn't my world, but it touched it. I understood frameworks, thresholds, escalation paths. Ethan wasn't telling me to fight. He was explaining how systems reacted when someone ignored them. He said insurers cared less about intent than exposure. A documented reason mattered more than a shouted excuse. Silence protected companies. Writing exposed them. That was the moment the weight shifted. This wasn't about me losing a job. It was about Grant choosing to gamble with structures he barely respected. My anger didn't vanish, but it reorganized itself. I stopped seeing myself as the center of damage and started seeing the perimeter widening outward. That afternoon, an email arrived from Grant. Polite, controlled. He reminded me of my confidentiality obligations and attached a draft non-disclosure agreement. The message warned against speculation, against mischaracterizing business decisions, against unnecessary conversations. It ended with a line about mutual professionalism and moving forward quietly. I read it twice and felt nothing. Fear was what the email wanted. Compliance was what it expected. What it revealed instead was urgency. Grant wasn't trying to protect the company. He was trying to protect himself before anyone else asked questions. I forwarded the message to Ethan without comment. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it wasn't reassurance or strategy, it was curiosity. He told me he was pulling the company's insurance filings, starting with the directors' and officers' policy. He knew the structure. Years earlier, he'd been part of the team that helped shape it. I didn't ask what he was looking for. I already knew. The fight hadn't begun. Because this wasn't a fight, it was a review. And reviews didn't need anger. They needed records, timing, and patience. For the first time since the meeting, I felt steady, like the ground had stopped moving under my feet. Whatever came next would move slowly, methodically, without raised voices or dramatic exits. I wasn't preparing for retaliation. I was preparing for observation. Grant thought silence meant safety. He was wrong. Silence was simply the space where systems gathered evidence, aligned themselves, and waited for permission to act. In their own time. Quietly. Precisely. Ethan didn't spread papers across the table or draw diagrams. He opened his laptop, adjusted his glasses, and spoke like someone who had explained this before to rooms full of executives who thought confidence could substitute for comprehension. He wasn't a litigator. He was a risk and governance advisor. Someone companies hired quietly before trouble. Not after. Years ago. He had helped design insurance frameworks for multiple corporations, the kind meant to absorb mistakes without collapsing the structure. He pulled up the directors and officers policy and scrolled slowly, deliberately. This wasn't a hunt, it was a confirmation. He pointed to a section labeled Conduct Exclusions, then another on ethical violations. The language was plain, almost boring, which made it dangerous. Termination based on pregnancy wasn't a gray area. It was a direct breach. Coverage didn't shrink under those circumstances. It stopped. What surprised me wasn't the clause itself. It was how little it required. No lawsuit, no press, no accusation, just notification. The policy demanded disclosure of material governance violations through approved compliance channels. Once that happened, insurers were obligated to reassess protection for the individuals involved. Ethan emphasized individuals, not the company. That distinction tightened something in my chest. I asked if this meant going after Grant. Ethan shook his head. This wasn't pursuit. It was sequence. Systems didn't care about motives or emotions. They reacted to triggers. A documented reason in writing was one of them. Grant had supplied it himself. The room felt smaller as the implications settled. I thought about how this would look from the outside. A fired employee, a pregnancy, an advisor partner. It could be painted as retaliation, and that mattered to me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance, dignity, and quiet. Ethan listened, then said something that steadied me. The notification wouldn't come from us. It couldn't. There were independent compliance intermediaries whose sole function was to review and escalate governance risks. Anonymous, procedural, boring in the way that dismantled power without spectacle. He named one, a firm I recognized from past audits. The decision point hovered there, unspoken. Once the notice was filed, nothing could be controlled. No apology could reverse it. No explanation could soften it. I wasn't pushing a button. I was stepping aside while the machine did what it was built to do. I nodded. Slowly. My hesitation wasn't fear. It was gravity. Ethan began preparing the documentation. Careful, detached. The notification would list facts only, no names attached, routed through the intermediary, no accusations, just compliance. As he worked, I felt the tension sharpen into focus. This wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. Grant had forgotten a clause everyone ignored because it rarely activated. Forgotten clauses were the most honest ones. They waited patiently, gathering relevance, until someone arrogant enough handed them reason to exist. The next part is only understood by the truly observant. Don't miss it. I said yes without ceremony, not because it felt brave, but because it felt correct. Decision has a temperature, and this one was cold. There would be no lawsuit, no press release, no righteous speech, only procedure, followed exactly, because procedure was the point. The email took less than 5 minutes to draft. No emotion, no accusation, no names. It listed dates, language used, and a single attached document containing the termination reason in writing. It cited the relevant governance category and requested a standard coverage review. When I read it back, it sounded like something written by a machine. That was intentional. Machines don't get accused of revenge. I watched Ethan send it through the intermediary's portal and felt nothing dramatic. No relief, no satisfaction, just alignment. Once submitted, the process didn't belong to us anymore. That was the ethical line I needed. We weren't pushing, we were reporting. The shift inside the company came faster than I expected. Grant didn't know what had been filed, but he sensed movement. He called his general counsel first, then human resources, then scheduled a leadership check in that wasn't on the calendar an hour earlier. Control looks like confidence until it starts making noise. By late afternoon, my phone lit up with a message from a former colleague. Short. Careful. Something's happening. Legal's panicking. I didn't reply. Observation requires distance. Grant tried next. A voicemail. Friendly on the surface, strained underneath. He talked about misunderstandings and collaboration, about resolving things internally. The word internally came up 3 times. I deleted it without listening again. That evening, Ethan received a call from someone he knew, a lawyer adjacent to the review. The conversation was brief, professional. When he hung up, he didn't smile. "They're asking how exposed the executive team is," he said. I asked what the response was. There was a pause. Then he quoted it exactly. "If D&O steps back, we're exposed." The words settled heavily. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were factual. Exposure wasn't punishment. It was reality without insulation. It meant personal risk, frozen decisions, and boards that suddenly remembered their duties. Grant would fight this. I knew that. He would deny intent, shift blame, demand explanations. But none of that mattered now. The process didn't argue. It reviewed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. This wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to be complicit in silence. I had chosen the narrow path, the one that didn't bend towards spectacle or cruelty. Just structure, just truth, placed where it belonged. And once placed, it could not be retrieved. Momentum replaced silence the moment the coverage review began. The insurer's request arrived without drama. A neutral notice asking for clarification, documentation, and timelines. It was procedural language, but inside the company, it landed like an alarm. Reviews meant pauses, and pauses frightened people who lived on speed. Grant reacted immediately. He demanded explanations before questions had finished forming. He called human resources into meetings that felt more like interrogations. He insisted the termination had followed policy, that the decision was operational, not personal. When that didn't settle the room, he shifted tone and blamed process failures. "HR handled it," he said, repeating the phrase as if repetition could create truth. The insurer asked again. This time, more precisely. They wanted the written rationale, internal correspondence, and confirmation of compliance review. The request wasn't accusatory, it was methodical. I watched from a distance as documents were gathered, emails surfaced, and timelines tightened. Each step narrowed the story Grant could tell. He tried to reframe me next. In one meeting, my name came up with an edge I recognized. He described me as emotional, distracted, difficult to manage after announcing my pregnancy. The room went quiet. People looked down. No one defended him. Words spoken to insurers didn't disappear just because they were uncomfortable. By midweek, the board stopped pretending this was contained. Emergency calls replaced standing meetings. Directors asked questions they should have asked months earlier. Who approved the termination? Why HR wasn't present? Why the reason was written so plainly? Speed, once praised, now looked reckless. The insurer requested confirmation that no additional governance risks existed. That was the moment panic surfaced openly. Grant's confidence fractured into urgency. He demanded legal opinions. He pressed for assurances that coverage remained intact. None came. Then the bank called. The message was brief and devastating in its restraint. Credit facilities would be temporarily paused until governance risk was clarified. Not canceled, not threatened. Paused. The safest word banks use when they are afraid. I learned about it from a forwarded note. No commentary attached. The impact was immediate. Projects stalled. Approvals froze. Executives recalculated their exposure. The board scheduled another emergency session. Momentum had fully shifted. What began as a quiet review accelerated into something visible, measurable, and expensive. No one mentioned my pregnancy anymore. No one questioned emotion. The conversation had moved to numbers, liability, and survival, and beneath it all, the review continued, steady and impartial, doing exactly what it was designed to do, Every update arrived faster than the last, compressing time and tightening nerves, until even seasoned executives understood momentum no longer belonged to Grant, or to emotion, but to process alone, and its consequences were already irreversible. If you watch until the end, you will understand what everyone else missed. The notice arrived without warning, and yet it felt inevitable. The insurer's letter didn't accuse or explain. It stated a conclusion. Coverage for the company remained under review, but personal protection for Grant Holloway was withdrawn effective immediately. Directors' and officers' insurance existed to shield judgment errors, not deliberate violations. Grant had crossed that line alone. The board convened within hours. Emergency meetings no longer carried urgency. They carried fear. Faces that once deferred to Grant now avoided his. No one sat beside him. Chairs shifted subtly, like bodies instinctively creating distance from heat. Risk, once abstract, had become personal. Grant tried to regain command. He spoke fast, louder than necessary, insisting this was a misunderstanding. He blamed HR, then legal, then market timing. Each explanation landed weaker than the last. Directors exchanged glances, calculating their own exposure. Protection mattered now, not loyalty. I wasn't in the room, but I could imagine it clearly. I had seen this dynamic before during crises I was hired to prevent. Power evaporates when insulation disappears. Without coverage, confidence turns brittle. Grant demanded answers, demanded names, demanded a target. Who sued us? He shouted. The question sharp with disbelief. Silence followed. It stretched longer than comfort allowed. Finally, the outside counsel spoke, voice level, almost apologetic. No one did. Those 3 words carried more force than any accusation. There was no enemy to fight, no lawsuit to crush, no narrative to control. The system had moved without anger or agenda. It had simply stopped protecting him. The board shifted from reaction to survival. Directors asked what steps were required to restore coverage. The answer was immediate and unforgiving. Grant could not remain in his role. As long as he represented the company, risk could not be isolated. His presence itself was the problem. Grant argued. He promised reforms, apologies, statements. He offered distance from decisions, committees, oversight. None of it mattered. Insurance logic was blunt. Remove the exposure, or remain unprotected. The vote followed. Quiet and unanimous. Grant was relieved of authority pending further review. Access suspended, signing rights revoked. The man who built his power on speed was immobilized by procedure. I felt no rush of triumph when I heard. Satisfaction arrived colder, steadier. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence unfolding exactly as designed. Each domino had fallen because the one before it had been pushed by arrogance, not by me. Grant lost protection first, then control, then relevance. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. And that, I realized, was the most devastating form of accountability a system could deliver. Nothing was loud, nothing was public. Yet everyone understood what had happened. Grant wasn't defeated by an opponent, but by exposure. The architecture he ignored finally responded, watching that quiet end. I understood something lasting systems don't rage. They conclude, and when they do, there is nowhere left to stand. Alone together. The call came late, when tension had settled into a steady ache instead of panic. Grant's name flashed on my phone, and for a moment I considered letting it ring. I answered anyway, because avoidance would have given him something I no longer owed. He started with pleading. He said he'd miscalculated, that things had moved too fast, that the board was overreacting. His voice cracked when he said my name, as if familiarity could rebuild authority. Then pleading slid into accusation. He said I had forced this, that I knew how fragile the system was, that I should have come to him first. I listened without interrupting. Breath even, pulse steady. When he finished, the silence made him rush to fill it. "I didn't file anything," I said. "I just stopped protecting you." The line landed harder than shouting ever could. He told me I was being unreasonable, emotional, vindictive. I reminded him, calmly, that those words were already documented. He went quiet again, and this time the quiet belonged to me. Within the hour, the board convened, not to debate strategy, but to contain damage. Directors asked whether Grant could remain while coverage was renegotiated. Legal answered with numbers instead of opinions. Risk could not be segmented, while authority remained centralized. The logic was brutal and clean. Grant tried one last time. He joined the call uninvited, voice sharp, demanding loyalty. No one defended him. No one met his eyes through the screen. When the vote was called, it happened quickly, hands raised without discussion. The decision wasn't personal. It was operational. The motion passed. Grant Holloway was removed, effective immediately. He called again, but this time the line went dead. His access to corporate systems had already been revoked, email credentials disabled, calendar ownership transferred, signature authority terminated. There was no transition window. There never is when risk spikes. I felt the pressure lift, replaced by a cold clarity. This wasn't victory, it was resolution. The confrontation had ended, not with words, but with permissions disappearing one by one. Later, I received a single message from legal confirming the change in authority. No commentary, no apology, just confirmation. Grant lost his power the way he'd tried to strip mine. Quickly, quietly, without ceremony. I closed my phone and sat still, breathing through the aftermath. What suffocated him was not my action, but the absence of my silence. I hadn't attacked. I had stepped aside and let structure speak. And structure, once engaged, doesn't argue, it removes. It ends when authority collapses under its own weight, leaving only accountability, procedure, and the quiet understanding that protection is conditional, never permanent, and always earned by those who respect systems. I expected noise after Grant's removal, but there was none. No headlines, no leaks, no triumphant commentary. The company issued a short statement about leadership transition and governance review, and the world moved on. Quiet justice doesn't announce itself, it settles. Grant vanished quickly, not fired publicly, not escorted out, just gone. His name stopped appearing on agendas, then in emails, then in industry conversations. People avoided mentioning him, the way professionals do when a career ends without ceremony. In our world, disappearance is judgment. Inside the company, structure replaced chaos, committees formed, signing authority redistributed. External auditors arrived without resistance. The board spoke in careful sentences, aware that survival required humility. What Grant called speed, they now called exposure. What he dismissed as risk, they treated as lesson. I watched from a distance, no longer inside the building, yet still aware of its pulse. The anger I carried dissolved into something lighter. Not joy, not satisfaction. Relief, the kind that comes when you realize you don't have to carry a lie anymore. Emails began arriving from people I hadn't heard from in years. Advisors, banks, compliance firms. They asked if I was available for short-term consulting, governance reviews, transition oversight. They didn't mention Grant. They didn't need to. My name now meant stability, not disruption. One offer stood out. A senior advisory role, meaningful scope, real authority. It came with an invitation to return to my former company in a formal capacity, to help stabilize what remained. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted the systems back, without the silence that once came with them. I considered it carefully. not out of bitterness, but clarity. Going back would have tied my future to a place that only valued me after damage was done. Justice doesn't require proximity. Distance can be ethical. I declined the offer to return. I accepted the advisory role elsewhere, where governance wasn't treated as an inconvenience. The response was respectful, final, no pressure. Life slowed. I began preparing for what mattered next, without urgency, without fear. Grant never reached out again. He didn't have to. His absence was complete. Justice arrived quietly, exactly as promised. No spectacle, no revenge, just alignment restored, consequences distributed, and the rare comfort of knowing that doing the right thing, slowly and precisely, can still reshape outcomes. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and sufficient. Long after the company finished rebuilding without the man who believed protection was permanent, I carried that lesson forward, trusting process over noise, patience over fury, and evidence over ego, knowing that quiet accountability endures longer than outrage, and that restraint, once chosen, becomes a form of lasting strength for me, always today forward. I gave birth on a quiet morning, the kind that doesn't rush you. The room smelled clean, almost neutral, and for the first time in months, my body stopped bracing for impact. Holding my daughter, I understood protection in its simplest form, not leverage, not contracts, just responsibility passed forward. Steady and deliberate, recovery gave me space to think. The chaos of the past months receded into something instructional rather than painful. I followed the news out of habit, not anxiety. The company completed its restructuring. Committees became permanent, policies thickened. No one spoke Grant's name. That absence felt appropriate, like a scar that no longer needed explanation. A week later, I accepted a new role. The organization was smaller, quieter, and precise about its values. Ethics were not a slogan on the website. They were written into authority limits, escalation paths, and decision records. I wasn't hired to clean up disasters. I was hired to prevent them. The offer came without urgency, which told me everything I needed to know. My days slowed into rhythm. Meetings ended on time. Questions were welcomed instead of feared. When disagreements surfaced, they were documented, not buried. I brought my daughter home, knowing the work I did aligned with the world I wanted her to inherit. Sometimes I thought about Grant, not with anger, but with clarity. He wasn't undone by malice or conspiracy. He was undone by choosing convenience over structure. Systems don't punish. They respond. When respected, they protect everyone. When ignored, they withdraw quietly. I learned something lasting through all of it. Dignity doesn't need spectacle. Justice doesn't require noise. Accountability doesn't demand hatred. It requires patience, records, and the courage to stop covering for people who refuse to be careful. That certainty carried me forward, reminding me daily that stability is built slowly, protected quietly, and sustained by people willing to choose ethics even when shortcuts appear tempting always again. As I watched my daughter sleep, I felt the calm of alignment settle in fully. No one took revenge. The system just did what it was designed to do. What stayed with me most was the quiet part, the long pauses, the moments when I chose not to react, but to observe. That restraint wasn't weakness, it was self-respect. And that's something I hope you felt too. Like you were standing right there with me, holding your breath, waiting for the next step. Are you staying with me until the end of this story? And if you could change one decision I made along the way, what would it be? I'd really love to know. Where are you listening from right now? If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. A simple like helps more than you might think. And sharing the video might help someone else feel a little less alone. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. There are more stories ahead, quiet ones, real ones, where dignity still matters.